it's sort of like we don't live in one United States. Like we live in all these different tribes, right? All of which have like different permission structures of what's a permission structure is basically like what kind of behavior is allowed or encouraged or discouraged or lauded or whatever in your tribe. And so most Democrats have the permission structure of political violence is completely unacceptable, and that's fantastic. But there's also these like smaller tribes where the permission structure is I can get a lot of praise and a lot of fame and a lot of status by dancing on Charlie's grave.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm here today with Julian Adorney, who writes for Heal the West and is a columnist for Reality's Last Stand. I'm super excited for a great conversation, so welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Awesome. So let's start off. Just tell me who you are, where you're from.
Yeah, so I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I spent a couple years in Kenya, which was sort of the formation of this whole thing, because I saw in so many places it's such a wonderful and amazing country, but I was there for election season, and it's incredibly toxic there. You actually have rival tribes that are focused on killing each other. Years ago in recent years they'd be like hunting each other. Guns are outlawed, so they'd be using like bows and arrows, things like that. Me and the other kind of tourists or folks, non-natives who were living there were told, in the lead up to election cycle, don't only travel in like safe vehicles, don't travel on motorcycles because you never know when a fight's going to break out. And stock up on food for like 2 weeks before the election because after the election there's probably going to be rioting and we'll probably won't be able to get any food. And so it was absolutely insane. And so I came back to the US and I thought, oh my God, we're on this dark path, and maybe we're not as far along as Kenya is, but I saw where that path leads and I thought, I've got to like devote my energies to doing something about that.
Wow. When you kind of do like a compare and contrast, like how do we look in comparison to that level of tribal conflict?
It's a good question. We looked a lot better before last Wednesday.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I wrote about this in my last Heal the West piece, but I think that there's sort of concentric circles of what would be termed acceptable political violence. And so the first concentric circle, the smallest one, is like basically just Hitler, Like I think a healthy society, if Hitler takes power, one of us would kill him. And that's a pretty healthy society, right? Like most people would agree that that's something you should do. That's the smallest concentric circle. The bigger concentric circle outside of that is basically other political figures. And this can include things like I would consider MLK a somewhat political figure, although he was never elected. And I would consider, obviously Ronald Reagan, Bush, Clinton, U.S. senators, Gabby Gifford, like all these folks. We've been flirting with political violence towards these figures for a while, and it's this incredibly sad thing. But that's also been happening since at least the days of Teddy Roosevelt, But then there's this third concentric circle of political violence, and the second circle is bad enough. I mean, the fact that we are in a place where you can take shots at a sitting congresswoman, at Nancy Pelosi or at folks on the right, like that's terrible, right? But there's this like even more dangerous third concentric circle of acceptable political violence, which is mainstream, like big public figures who disagree with me. And that's where I kind of worry that we are now. And so I've been thinking a lot about, I have friends they weren't as big as Kirk by any means, but they were doing packed speaking gigs and things like that. And now they're kind of rethinking, do I want to do this? Is this going to be safe for me or should I just shut up? And most of the folks who I know are deciding I'm going to keep speaking up. But there's a sort of cascading like ripple effect of fear in our country right now. So I think is really, really sad to see.
It feels like we've lost all sense of nuance. Like, it's like, I think, like you said, almost all of us would agree it's okay to kill Hitler. But it's kind of like there's this mentality like on a lot of the left, well, everyone to the right of center is essentially basically Hitler when you think about it. Like there's kind of a slippery slope argument to where if we start going a little bit right, it's going to fall all the way to fascism. Like, so you might as well nip it in the bud because like Charlie Kirk is basically Hitler. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that sometimes for sure. And in some ways, I've written about this too in my most recent Healed West article, called they weren't born wanting to do this. But I sort of divide the U.S. and our political tribes into two groups, and so I saw this a lot with the left after Charlie's death. So many figures on the left, from Barack Obama to Nancy Pelosi to, Cenk Ungor. I'm mispronouncing his name, but the Young Turks guy, to all these leftist influencers, to Ezra Klein came out and said, "This is appalling. We don't stand for this. We oppose political violence in the strongest possible terms. We need to learn to speak to each other again." And that's incredibly hopeful because that's like 90% of people, right? But then this other completely different 10% that I saw on Twitter, on TikTok, on Blue Sky, and it's exactly like you said. It's sort of like, well, anyone to the right of, Barack Obama is Hitler, and so I'm gonna dance on Charlie's grave. And some of those posts got incredibly popular. I mean, there was one tweet that had like 181,000 likes, based saying that Charlie had it coming. And so I think they're this fringe minority even among the left. But I do worry that the left's a big place, and so even a fringe minority represents millions of people.
Mm, interesting. Do you see like the mirror image of something like that fanaticism on the left? Do you see a mirror image on the right?
It's a good question. Let's see. I want to say yes. I think it's asymmetric, but I want to say yes. And so, for instance, Elizabeth Newman has been a big influence on me. She is a counterterrorism expert, spent, a lot of years at the DHS, rose up very high in their ranks, and she is a very strong conservative Christian. And she wrote a book called Kingdom of Rage, basically sounding the warning about the rise of political extremism and political violence on the right. And so the fact that a call like that is coming, not from, some left-wing radical, but from someone who's themselves conservative and themselves Christian, I think gives a lot of credence to the fact that like there is this big threat on the right. The rise of Christian nationalism, the rise of some folks on the dissident right. Some folks on the dissident right are just reasonable, thoughtful people who I happen to disagree with very strongly, and some of them are very full of emotional pain and willing to lash out. And I think you see Christian nationalists. I think you see that in some of the folks who were there, a lot of folks who were there on January 6th, and some of the folks who supported Stop the Steal and things like that. I think it's an asymmetric problem, but is there on both sides for sure.
Hmm. It seems like with both the left and the right, there's enough ambiguity in language to where it's hard to tell sometimes who the radicals are. And like I'm thinking like on the right, like Christ is king, that expression, to where
Yeah.
like all Christians essentially believe that Christ is king, that Jesus is God, but the phrase Christ is king was like co-opted in such a way that it was kind of like a signal to a certain group of people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there is a lot of these kind of code words, and I've historically been leery of the idea of dog whistling, at least when it comes to like racial matters and from elected officials and things like that. But there is a fair amount of that. And there is a fair amount of that sort of like almost speaking in code that's tremendously concerning because it really does obfuscate what's the size of this problem. And even among extremists, you have a wide range of people. One person may like dance on the grave of Charlie, and that's terrible. Another person may be willing to pull the trigger, and that's much, much worse. But there is this sort of like range.
For sure. Have you noticed like rise in anti-Semitism on both the fringe left and the fringe right?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. That's something that's been incredibly concerning, and I have Jewish friends, I have Jewish like in re sort of relatives, not biological, but in-laws, among my aunts and uncles, things like that. And so I care very deeply about um combating anti-Semitism, and it's been incredibly sad to me to see how Jewish folks are sort of always the canary in the coal mine for reasons I don't fully understand. But after October 7th, you saw a lot of the left, and you kind of talk about this in your book. You saw a lot of the left, or sort of come out swinging against the Jewish people in ways that were really appalling. You saw very popular professors tweeting things like, settlers aren't civilians, this isn't hard, things like that. But I've also seen this on the right. I mean, there's a non-trivial number of folks on the dissident right who are highly anti-Semitic. And obviously you have a lot of praise among folks on the dissident right for Kanye West's new song Hail Hitler, or for the Nazi regime, or things like that, which is, I mean, incredibly anti-Semitic.
It's so bizarre to me, this kind of fringe right that seems to be growing, that's trying to rebrand the Nazis as the good guys. That's just wild to me.
Yeah, it's insane. I've been trying not to follow too much of that because I think it's a very online phenomenon too. And that's one thing that it's funny, because you and I both live on Twitter a little bit. And so I think we see a lot of the worst elements of society come out. And so I sort of want to sound a note of peace or reassurance to our audience of like, it's not like this offline. Online, what Wilfred Riley, who I think you and I both follow because I've heard you quoted in your book. So someone tweeted, why is Hitler becoming so popular? And Wilfred Riley responded like, I say this with love so you don't get your ass beat in a bar. He's not. Like, offline, he's actually not.
Yeah. No, I had Wilfred Riley on here on this podcast, and we talked a little bit about that type of dissident right type thing. I think that's interesting, and certainly, it's kind of interesting to analyze whether it's the far left or the far right. Like, your typical Republican, your typical Democrat is interested in going to their kids' Little League game and going to work and, having leisure time. Like, the typical person is not, trying to say that Hitler was the good guy of World War II.
Yeah.
But there are a significant number of these people out there, whether it's that or trying to rebrand Chairman Mao as a good guy, whoever. There's enough of these people that you think, gosh, this, I think you said it was millions of people when you add it up. Like, that's enough people that could cause problems in society.
Yes, that is, I think that's exactly right. And that's something I've been thinking about more and more, is that there's this sort of, I think of it very crudely in terms of like, and I say crudely because it's a, simplified, right? But like, there's like mainstream America, and then there's like the extremist America on the left and the extremist America on the right, and that's a crude oversimplification because like we're all on a spectrum, to some extent, we all have trouble humanizing our political opponents, or at least a lot of us do. And that's something that all of us should like work on, but there is, crudely speaking, this sort of like extremist left America and extremist right America. On the one hand, this is, in percentage terms, a small number. It's not, when Trump said that, Charlie Kirk was murdered by the left, it's like, no, he wasn't. He was murdered by one person, and that one person found support among this tiny segment of the left. Same thing with the right. But in absolute numbers, that's still millions of people, and those are the people causing most of the problems in our society. That's the folks causing political violence, cheering on political violence, dehumanizing their political opponents, things like that, cutting off ties with friends and relatives, being the very loud and very obnoxious forces on Twitter. And I think we have to understand those folks better. And when I say understand them, I don't mean that like, oh, I should look down at you as like, oh, you poor, poor person who's so full of fear and pain that it bursts out of you. I mean, sort of like what Father Gregory Boyle talked about in his book, Tattoos in the Heart, because he's worked with gang members for decades. And he said, you can't understand someone, or you can't help someone from a lens of like, there's the helper and the helpee, and I'm better than you because I'm helping you. You have to understand people, and you have to talk to them as though like we're two separate people who are equals, both trying to cross the chasm. And I think that's how we have to start approaching these folks who are in, quote unquote extremist America, because they are in a lot of pain. They're the folks who our society's leaving behind. But if you get underneath their terror, so some of the ways that pain like manifests, a lot of them have legitimate grievances. It's like our society does fail a lot of folks on the margins, and I think that's worth grappling with.
It feels like the far left and the far right help each other recruit. Like they both look at moderates and say, those people on the other side of there are so bad, you need to turn to me because I'm going to defeat the communists, the fascists, whatever. Like I'm your kind of safety in a sense.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so I tweeted out recently, and I had one of the standard bearers of the dissident right, named Hunter Ash, to kind of retweet this for me to amplify it. And so I asked folks on the dissident right, like, how can society bless you? Like, how can we do better to serve you? And 90% of the responses, I swear, was basically stop demonizing white people for being white.
Mm,
And so it's like in an alternate world where critical race theory doesn't exist, and where Robin DiAngelo isn't out there, saying that there's no positive way to be white, and it's only ever something you should be ashamed of, and where the late Professor Catherine Polly Morgan from University of Toronto wasn't labeling people as like oppressors or oppressed based on their skin color and ethnicity and gender and sex and things like that. I think in a world where you don't have that, the dissident right isn't nearly as strong because they don't have any recruiting tools at that point. They don't have any like legitimate grievances. And the same thing on the left. I think the far left absolutely points to the rise of the dissident right and says, look how many racists there are. That's why we need critical race theory,
mm.
Look how many homophobic people there are. That's why we need queer theory. And so yeah, I think you're exactly right. Like they both feed each other.
It feels like they're speaking it into existence.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure like in the last 10 years or so, we had, I mean, maybe 50 years of declining racism, declining sexism, declining homophobia. In the last 10 years, all three of those have been on the rise. And to me, it feels like, as you were saying, like the reason they've been on the rise is like, let's just kind of poke white men repeatedly just to see if we can get a reaction. And eventually it's like, okay, like you want me to be racist and sexist? I will be.
Yeah. No, I think it's exactly right. And there are two things going on. One is like, we're all responsible for our own actions. I've had people on the left tell me, accuse me of being prejudiced or a bigot or of being, an angry, self-righteous white person, whatever. And it's like, it's on me whether or not I let that deform my soul and turn me into someone ugly. It's on me whether I let that affect my actions or make me into the character they believe I am. And it's very important that I not do that. It's very important that I stay true to my principles and true to these sort of common humanity politics. And so there's a personal element, but there's also a sense of like, this was all very predictable. One of the reasons that I've opposed critical race theory so much is because on its face, I think a lot of the ideas are terrible, and we can get more into that, I have respect for my friends who advocate for critical race theory, and I think they're good people, but I think the ideas themselves are very bad. But the other reason is that the minute you start inverting a hierarchy and creating a new hierarchy of people, call it oppressors or oppressed, or bring in what Kimberly Crenshaw talked about of people standing on each other's shoulders, things like that. Whatever examples you want to choose. The minute you invert that hierarchy and start, instead of saying, "Hey, we're all equal," instead say like, "You're here, then you're here, then you're here, then you're here," the people at the bottom of that new hierarchy are going to be pissed off, and that's this incredibly like the backlash. The fact that CRT has been feeling the rise of the dissident right, I think, is incredibly obvious. And it's been really frustrating watching it happen because, like you said, we were making tremendous progress towards letting go of racism, sexism, homophobia, things like that until about 2014.
I think another way to piggyback off of that, another way that CRT kind of boosts the dissident right is, there's a lack of nuance. So if you're a white person, we put you in this category of racist, no matter what. You can devote your entire life to fighting against racism. You can go out at BLM rallies and wash the feet of black people. You can just be constantly apologizing for your whiteness. You are in this category of racist, just like former KKK leader David Duke is in this category of racist. There's no differentiation there. So if somebody's like, if you guys over here are just doing nothing but demonizing me, I might as well go hang out with these people over here who are praising me for being a white man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think is exactly right. And Michelle Alexander talked about this actually in her book, The New Jim Crow, which I read years ago. And she sort of talked about, she described the rise of the Black is Beautiful and the gay pride movements as basically saying, look, when people kick you over and over again over your immutable identity, you're going to flip it around and try and make that identity into a positive thing.
Mm.
Um, and I don't have strong opinions on whether that's like good or bad when it comes to black identity politics or gay identity politics, things like that. But I will say, I think it gets dangerous when the group that practice identity politics are the majority because they then have a fair amount of government power. And
Mm.
we've seen in the past in the US, white identity politics has this terrible history. And but it's not surprising that people are going back to that because it is exactly what Michelle Alexander talked about of if you grow up and come up through high school and you're consistently labeled like an oppressor and the root of all evil and things like that. And there are intellectual distinctions with critical race theory of like being white versus whiteness, but I'm not sure that those like sink in on an emotional level. And so when you're told all of this stuff, like one of the people I think about is like John Bender from The Breakfast Club, right?
Mm.
Are you familiar with the movie?
Yeah, yeah. Good
Yeah,
movie.
yeah. For anyone who doesn't know, he's kind of the criminal in the movie. And so he's this white dude who was made in the 80s. And so and then at that point, like they're all white. It's which is something that, like I think could be done better now, but like at that point it was 80s. And so he grows up in this tremendously abusive household, and his father knocks his mother around every night, and his father like yells at him of like you're a piece of shit and all this stuff. And then he has this difficulty dealing with authority, and so then the authority figure in the detention just like keeps yelling at him, just keeps trying to impose his will on him. And as someone who grew up like a little bit like John Bender, I had, my parents were wonderful, but I didn't deal with abuse as a kid, and suicidality and stuff like that. It's like, what I feel like he really needs is someone to tell him, like, no, you actually have some kind of worth. You actually have intrinsic worth. You have the same worth as any other human being. You are made in God's own image, and that is a remarkable thing, and fuck anyone who tells you otherwise. And I worry that instead critical race theory is sort of telling him, yeah, you're white. Like, you are an oppressor. You are a bad person. You are this sort of like problem in society that just reifies his sense of shame. And that's tremendously bad for the John Benners of the world because you shouldn't live that way. You shouldn't live with a sense of like internalized shame. But it's also really bad because he's going to do bad things with that sense of shame. He's going to join movements that are bad.
Yeah, I mean, bringing Christianity into it is interesting. I feel like there's a verse in the book of James that says, "If you keep the whole law and stumble in one point, you're guilty of all." And the point of that verse is to direct you towards a Messiah who can absorb your sin and kind of cover you. And I feel like with critical race theory and a lot of these woke ideologies, it's like Christianity minus Jesus. Like
Yeah.
you're a horribly depraved, guilty sinner, but there's no redemption coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's the thing that's really bothered me about the left and increasingly on the right too, is the sense of like, you are defined by the worst things you've ever done. That was the problem with cancel culture. I mean, one of many problems. But to me, from a spiritual standpoint, from an existential standpoint, that was one of the bigger problems was you did this bad thing 10 years ago, and that one snapshot of your life is all I need to know to label you as a deplorable, as a bigot, as someone who shouldn't be allowed to work or have friends or things like that. And it really is, it's like, it's all the worst judgments of a fundamentalist religion with none of the grace offered by Christianity, none of the chance for redemption or forgiveness or things like that. And it's incredibly toxic.
We talked a little bit about Christianity. I'm wondering how your faith informs some of your intellectual work.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I do basically pray before and as I'm writing every single piece. And I just ask God, like, will you, whatever you want to say, will you say that? You've given me this platform. Will it, like, can I use this platform to advance your kingdom in whichever way you want me to? It's incredibly important to me that I do good in the world, that I'm sort of always focused on, is my writing making things better? Is my writing reaching the people? And especially lately, it's been a question of like, is my writing reaching the broken, the despised, the people? And I think Romans 8 that's Paul talks about. Is my writing reaching and making a meaningful difference, offering some kind of light through the darkness for people who might otherwise think the darkness is all encompassing. That's very much where the heart is. That's why I do homeless ministry. It's why I've been starting to, train to do prison ministry. It's why I write, and it's why I write about like meaning and purpose and finding God and all these things, is that I want something I say to be that ray of light into someone's life, especially if they may not have that many rays of light, because that's going to be tremendously good for them and probably good for society. At least that's the hope.
Yeah, I'm wondering how difficult it is for you to formulate some of these political views in light of faith, because I feel like I've heard people say Jesus was a fill in the blank with pretty much any political ideology, Republican, Democrat, socialist, libertarian, anything you like. That's what Jesus was, because that's what I am. Therefore, that's how I see him. How do you navigate that tendency with I forget who it was, the theologian who said, I'm not interested, if God's on my side, it's am I on his side?
I really like that. Yeah. Yeah, 'cause I have heard that. Stephen Colbert went on this long rant back in 10, 15 years ago when he was at the Colbert Show, and he said, conservatives have to either accept that they don't know who Jesus is or don't care who Jesus is. And I thought that's incredibly offensive. Like, who talks like that, And there's a lot of that on the right too, of like, oh well, you can't be a real Christian unless you're on the right. I find that stuff incredibly frustrating. And it's why on Twitter I talk about I'm like God over politics, I really like how Michael Ware put it in his book, The Spirit of Our Politics, because he's one of Obama's theological advisors, right, in the Obama administration. And he basically said that you can be a devout Christ follower and vote for pretty much anyone under the sun. The question is not who do you vote for, the question is why do you vote that way? And so Christ will advocate certain principles of like treat all human beings with dignity, things like that. But if you're voting based on those principles, then there's no contradiction with our faith. Whether that leads you to vote for Trump or Biden or Harris or Bernie Sanders or whoever it may be.
That's interesting. Do you feel like there are certain politics, like on the surface, I agreed with what you're saying, but then I was like, could I call myself a Christian and legitimately vote for like the Nazi party?
Yeah.
Are there limits to that, what you're saying?
I was thinking that exact same question. That's why, I gave the examples of Trump to Sanders and I stopped,
Yeah.
That's a thorny question. There were like, 'cause let's see. So there were a lot of Christians who supported Hitler, and there were a lot of like cultural Christians who supported Hitler, and the Christians who I very much know is like deep, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, folks like that, were determined to oppose Hitler with their lives if necessary. I suppose for me, I think it comes down to where's your heart in all of this. Because I think you could vote for. I don't think you can judge someone's character based on the knowledge they have. I think it's more about why they do the things they do. And so hypothetically, if you vote for like Hitler or like Chairman Mao or Stalin or folks like that, not that Mao or Stalin had elections, but hypothetically, if you vote for them because you think, well, I think they really care about farmers and I think they really care about poor people. I think they'll try and do their best to usher in a better world. To me, it's like that's a very Christian reason to vote for them, even though they then did terrible things. And yeah, with Hitler, it's like it would be hard because prejudice is baked so heavily into his platform. But if for some reason someone maybe wasn't aware of that or did the emotional calculus and thought, I think he'll be really, really good for a lot of people, even if he's also bad for some people, and voted for him because they thought, well, he will be a blessing for a lot of people. It's like they probably repented really, really quickly after that decision. But that decision in and of itself, I don't think would be unchristlike.
How much do you judge intent versus impact? Because I could say like, oh, I'm supporting this Maoist candidate because I want to liberate people and lift them out of poverty. And the result could be 60 or 70 million people dead, but like maybe my heart was in the right place. Does that how do you weigh that?
I focus completely on intent and not on impact. And one of the reasons is that we don't usually know what will happen. And we often think we do, but that's sort of a conceit brought on by history and by a sort of look in the rearview mirror. in the 1920s, 1930s, there were tons of intellectuals, very, very smart people, much smarter than I am, who thought communism can work, you know?
Mm.
And they had reason to think that in the early days of the Soviet Union, the USSR like industrialized much faster than the US, and their publicly available figures, which, you know, how much did they cook the books? Probably quite a bit, you know. But their publicly available figures said that the USSR was growing at a more rapid clip. GDP per year was growing at a more rapid clip than the US was. And so I think you could look at those numbers and say, well, maybe we should vote for communism. And I think that would be like now that would be a much harder decision to make because we have more information. But I think predicting the future is so difficult that I just focus on people's intentions. I just focus on their hearts more than were you right or wrong to do this.
Mm. Interesting. What other kind of stuff do you write about?
Um, I write fiction, so I'm writing this long kind of theological epic fantasy romance series right now. And I wrote first draft. I've been working on it since 2019. So I wrote first draft, and that came out okay. And then I read through it. I took this course from a wonderful fiction author, now deceased, named Holly Lyle, called How to Revise Your Novel. And so I went through that course, and I gutted the whole draft and rewrote it and wrote a second draft. And second draft was like 500,000 words, like 1,500 pages or something. And I read through that, and I felt like, okay, this is closer, but I kept feeling like this is the tip of the iceberg. I have more to say somehow. And so now I'm going back through the How to Revise Your Novel course, and now I'm going through and writing third draft. And third draft, I'm about 150K into it, and I'm doing all this research on different cultures and things like that, kind of exploring the world. And this one feels pretty solid. But the story's basically it's about a lot of things because epic fantasy is always about a lot of things, you know. And so there are different sub themes. But one of the biggest themes, I would say the biggest theme is it's my answer to the problem of the Odyssey, right? The problem of and I might be mispronouncing that. But basically, how can you have a god who's omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent? Right. So can see all, is all powerful, and is all good, and you still have the problem of evil. And this is sort of it's not my answer. Like this is the end of the discussion. This is all there is to say, because God's infinite. There's an infinite amount to say. But it is sort of it's like my answer. It's the aspect of the question that I don't see discussed very much. And so I'm sort of writing a very long book about the main character actually. Um, he loses in short succession his mother, his father, his best friend, the girl he was going to marry, and he gets kidnapped and for 100 years and put it sort of in stasis. And then he comes back and the world's completely changed. Everyone's gone. And he has to live with that. He has to find a way to pick himself up and put himself back together again. And so the long story is sort of his journey through that. So it's sort of my answer to the problem of evil.
Mm. How do you see your novel pertaining to the world we live in, or does it?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't write allegory, you know, it's like and none of the characters would ever refer to this world because it's like how would they possibly know that like Earth exists, you know? And so I think it's more like universal themes rather than sort of contemporary political commentary. Um, but it's a good question. Like there are themes of like bridge building, for instance. Like there are similar to how Tolkien did it, where you have like elves and dwarves and humans in Lord of the Rings, and they all have some pretty strong prejudices towards each other, and hobbits, of course. And then in the course of this adventure, you know, that starts with Fellowship of the Ring, you have them all become close friends, and you have like the wonderful friendship between like Gimli and Legolas, for instance, and how that evolved. And so in the same way, like for the story I'm writing, there's strong bridge building themes of how can we let go of our prejudice and our caricaturing of other people and actually see the human? How do we where do the worst stories of the other side come from? And how can we let those go when we're actually interacting with someone from that side? So that's kind of a big theme.
Interesting. Um, we started off talking a little bit about Charlie Kirk, and when you look at like both the shooting, but more so the response to the shooting on both sides, like what does that say about where we're at in America at the moment, and the current state of like tribalism and things like that?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's both very good and very bad. Very good in that, to reiterate, it's like most folks on the left have come out swinging against political violence and in favor of Kirk's legacy, sort of. I mean, Ezra Klein wrote a long piece in the New York Times saying that Charlie was doing politics the right way. Obama, Pelosi, all these political figures came out and denounced political violence. Ungor, the Young
Jink?
Turks guy,
Yeah.
Butcher, I mean, he and Charlie had some contentious debates, and there's a viral clip going around of them almost getting in a brawl, together at a debate. Which one of my friends was monitoring actually, and he was just like, "Oh God, this movement's going to go so viral."
Mm.
But then Senk came out and said, and he got so much heat from it from his followers, but he said, "No, I'm really sad Charlie's dead, and I wish we didn't live in this cultural climate." And so that's been very hopeful. The reason I say it's also very not hopeful is because there are these smaller tribes, these sort of echo chambers with, um, it's sort of like we don't live in one United States. Like we live in all these different tribes, right? All of which have like different permission structures of what's a permission structure is basically like what kind of behavior is allowed or encouraged or discouraged or lauded or whatever in your tribe. And so most Democrats have the permission structure of political violence is completely unacceptable, and that's fantastic. But there's also these like smaller tribes where the permission structure is I can get a lot of praise and a lot of fame and a lot of status by dancing on Charlie's grave.
Mm.
And that's been tremendously sad and frankly very worrying to see.
Mm. It seems like there's like part of the reason why I could be looking at the past through rose-colored glasses, but it seems like there was a time in the past where it was understood like we're all Americans and we all have similar core values. We have similar goals for where we want our country to be, but we have different ways of going about it, and therefore compromise with each other makes a lot of sense. And it seems like the general consciousness now is like the other side is fundamentally not like me. They don't share my core values. They don't share. We want America to go in different directions. So
Mhm.
compromising with them is actually like a very bad thing. Does that resonate?
Yes, I think it's exactly right. And the really funny thing about that is that because I have friends who hang out with a lot of political figures, right? And so I hear the same story from them all the time. If you get, say, Chuck Schumer, or some famous Republican congressman or Mitch McConnell, folks like that. If you get them in front of the cameras, they will be bombastic and they will say, no compromise, never. Our political opponents are evil. We will not give an inch. And that's why you're sending me money. You're sending me money because I will not compromise. And behind closed doors, like, hey, Mitch, great to see you. Hey, Chuck, great to see you. It's like they're all chummy.
Mm.
And so it's this sort of like, there is this attitude of no compromise, but it's it's sort of a lie, it's sort of like they're selling things they don't necessarily believe themselves.
Mm.
And that's incredibly frustrating to me because we buy it, we buy what they're selling, but they're only selling it to make money.
Mm. Wow. Do you feel like that money aspect, fundraising or lobbying, like whatever, you feel like that's a big motivator in to politicians?
I honestly think so. I think money, status, power. I mean, there are genuinely politicians who are in it for the right reasons and want to do the right thing. But it's just like any other profession. There's a mix, and I kind of worry that politics is magnetic to the corruptible. To borrow Frank Herbert's phrase, in that, yeah, it seems to attract folks who, and I do think a lot of this is sort of money, and a lot of this is sort of status and power and things like that.
It almost feels like there's a filter or a series of filters where you can be like involved in local politics with very little corruption or bad motives, but almost to filter up to state level and then national level, like it weeds out the people with good motives because
Yeah.
you have to sell out a little bit to get a certain degree of campaign finance or what have you, or a certain degree of connections. And so by the time you get to like senator or president or whatever level, you're left exclusively with people that have kind of sold out.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I would like to think it's not that way, and I would like to think that it doesn't, or at least it doesn't have to be that way, even if it's kind of that way now. But yeah, right now it does seem that we're no longer quite led by the best and brightest. We're now led by the people who are most successful at playing this kind of rigged game.
Mm, yeah, yeah. How do you see, you write for Reality's Last Stand, how do you see, like, academia playing into this?
It's a good question. I suppose I kind of worry that academia is driving some of the dysfunction, some of the dehumanization that we're facing. And one reason I say that, and I think you're familiar with this, because again, I read it in the woke mind, but you have a lot of social psychologists who they all lean very far left, and so you have a lot of peer-reviewed papers that pass muster by. The questions are sort of worded to demonize Republicans. One of my friends, Luke Conway, I believe, wrote about this liberal bullies. And he basically talked about how, like, if you're trying to measure left wing and right wing authoritarianism, the the scale to measure right wing authoritarianism basically says, like, do you support a strong leader who's willing to take action over the heads of Congress, which is bad, right? But like that's a modest question. And the skill to measure left wing authoritarianism is like, do you support, a violent uprising against, our political leaders or something? It's like these are qualitatively very different
Mm,
questions. And so I worry a lot this social psychology research is, and another example is a lot of social psychologists will basically publish papers sort of demonizing Republicans and sort of pathologizing the entire like conservative mindset of, I've even seen some papers, because a lot of papers show that conservatives on average are happier than liberals. And there are a variety of reasons for this, and no one's quite sure what like the reason is. But I've seen papers like pathologizing this, where it says, oh, well, the reason is that conservatives just lack empathy, and so they can't see the pain of the world, and kind of like you wrote in your book, like leftists have an unjust world an unjust worldview bias, sort of,
mm,
and there is some social psychology research that tries to like sort of pathologize anyone who doesn't have that, and I kind of worry that social psychology research, which seems oftentimes and generally with the best of intentions, but just because it's in a bubble, it seems geared to produce outcomes of our group is better than this other group in terms of our motives, our character, who we are as people, our intelligence, things like that. And I worry that that trend is really bad for our country.
mm, yeah. What do you do about that? Because it seems like, I mean, I think Jonathan Haidt said he was, I don't think he said, I've met like one other like conservative social psychologist, like everybody. I mean, it's probably like 99 to 1 or something
Yeah.
left leaning in social psychology. Like, how do you fix the research and like the teaching in a field like that that's so skewed?
Yeah, it's a really good question. My somewhat spicy take, which will probably piss off a lot of folks, is that I think we need some kind of affirmative action for conservatives.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is not like you hire the less qualified conservative over the more qualified liberal, but I mean, kind of like you talked about in the woke mind, is like there are a lot of professors who will openly say, I wouldn't hire an equally qualified conservative compared to an equally qualified liberal. I'd much rather hire the liberal, even if they have the same qualifications. And I think we need some sort of system to break that, because until we have more conservatives engaging in peer review and things like that, then I think what we really need is more adverse collaborations where conservatives and liberals get together on things and say, hey, I come at it from this standpoint, you come at it from this standpoint, but we both want to figure out the root cause of this problem, this societal problem. And I think those adverse collaborations, I mean, John Haidt talked about this, one of the reasons he founded Heterodox Academy. Those adverse collaborations can be really powerful in granting us new knowledge about the world and helping us to fix these intractable social problems like poverty, racism, things like that. And I think we need a lot more of those kind of adverse collaborations, and how we get more conservatives in the academy so they can participate in those collaborations in the first place. I think we might need some kind of affirmative action for conservatives, honestly.
That is quite a spicy take. You're right. Um, what do you think is the real world effect of like just the overwhelming amount of social science that has such a heavy skew?
Yeah. I think part of the problem is that basically problems stay intractable. The point of social science is to tell us about the world and tell us what the root cause of XYZ problem is and how we fix XYZ problem, right? And so if we only have the leftist perspective on what the root cause and how we fix it, then we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot. We're shooting kind of darts into our own brain, and we're limiting our understanding of these problems, which limits our understanding of the solutions. Criminal justice is a great example, right? It's like if you approach criminal justice through the standpoint of only looking at it through restorative justice, then you're going to conclude that things like, needle transfer programs and things like that are going to work great. And in the real world, from what I've seen, at least, and I'm getting kind of over my skis here, but like from what I've seen, they don't work that well. And you need the conservative approach on crime may be too harsh, but what we've seen in San Francisco and things like that is that you can go completely the opposite way and be way too gentle on crime in a way that incentivizes more crime. And so I think on the biggest intractable problems of our time, racism, crime, prejudice, poverty, helping people find meaning in their life, reducing the divorce rate, increasing the number of stable two-parent households, things like that. You really need the best and brightest minds all coming together to look at it from different perspectives so that they can see each other's blind spots. And if you don't have that, if you only have one perspective, you're going to miss a huge part of the picture and end up with some, proposed solutions that either don't work or only work halfway, or at worst, backfire catastrophically.
Yeah, it seems like there's this mentality that may start off with some good motives, like something about conservatism is judgmental or too harsh. Slut shaming is bad or harsh, but then you kind of spiral it out of control to the point where let's kind of reject the entire nuclear family, or like it's bad to ostracize drug addicts or something. And then it's like we're almost like enabling drug addicts with needle exchange programs. So it's like you've gone so far away from that kind of harsh conservative answer that you're actually making the problem worse in a sense.
Yes, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that we operate well when we're in this sort of like middle between the two extremes. And whenever one side takes complete control, we drift towards that extreme and things get bad.
Mm. Do you think that drifting towards extremes is natural, or is there a way to kind of help society achieve some type of like homeostasis in the middle? I don't know.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer, honestly. I think we could probably achieve some kind of homeostasis. I mean, it seemed like we had that for decades and possibly for centuries where we sort of spoke to each other across party lines. We spoke to each other across ideological lines, and that helped us to learn more about the world more accurately. I think if the bridge building efforts of folks like Brave Angels, and Bridge Entertainment Labs and things like that are successful, then we could definitely get close to that homeostasis and at least make the drifts, less extreme.
Mm. Mm. That is interesting. Um, what do you think is on the horizon in American politics? What are we coming into or up against?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, I wish I knew. I think I think we have a fork in the road. I think that we can take Charlie's assassination and we can let it further divide us. And we can, on the right, we can sort of let ourselves be drawn into fear and anger towards the left. And we can say, oh, like Trump did, oh, the left killed him. We're all under threat. And we can go the route of Attorney General Pam Bondi, who said, well, there's free speech and there's hate speech. And we're no longer going to tolerate any hate speech or any of this nonsense from the left of, steering for political violence or things like that. And we're going to prosecute that aggressively. And that's incredibly unconstitutional, by the way. There is hate speech is very much allowed in the US. But we can go this direction of I'm going to let Charlie's murder make me a worse person, make me more scared, more vengeful, more frustrated with the other side, less willing to see them as human beings and more willing to see them as enemies who will do anything to stop me. And you can do the same thing on the left, right? Where it's like you can a lot of the leftist folks on Blue Sky and folks like that are very worried that the right is going to come after them in vengeance, which Trump is not helping. But like there is that sort of intense fear that even folks on the street will say, "Oh well, you killed one of ours, we're gonna kill one of yours."
Mm.
We can let ourselves follow this very dark path towards the place that we started talking about, like towards this sort of Kenya sort of tribalism. And we can let it lead us deeper into a cycle of political violence and this reciprocal cycle of dehumanization and violence and refusing to see each other and refusing to talk across differences. Or, and that there is no bottom to that is the thing. I mean, this is one thing you find out as an addict, right? Is like, there's no bottom to your life. It can always get worse. Like, and I worry that if we take that route, we keep walking along that path, it will get worse and worse and worse and worse because it can always get worse. But the alternative is we can let Charlie's death bring out our better angels. We can do the thing that, a lot of folks on the right are doing, a lot of folks on the left are doing, of saying, no, Charlie did this the right way. He went to college campuses, he spoke to liberals, he talked to everyone who disagreed with him. If you look at his long form clips, he would often tell his interlocutors, good point. Like, I actually really appreciate what you said there. That was a good question, things like that. You made me think about something. And we can get back to that era of civic debate. We can let Charlie's death be a wake-up call for us as a people, to collectively pull out of this dark spiral that we're in and get back in touch with the better angels. And so I hope we do that.
Yeah, so do I. Who do you think, if you look at the landscape right now, who do you think is going to pick up the mantle for Charlie Kirk?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know, honestly. I mean, Colin Wright's been talking about, going to college campuses and putting signs up saying like there are only two genders, change our mind, stuff like that. And Colin's always been this incredible free speech advocate. And he walks the talk, when on Reality's Last Stand, he's been very open to people who are gender theorists and things like that, of like, if you want to write for my publication, as long as your piece is good, I will pay you, I'll promote it to my audience, I will send it to my audience, like, tell me why I'm wrong and I will pay you to do it, And so he really walks the walk. And so I don't know if there's gonna be one person who will take up the mantle of Charlie. But I sort of think all of us can. I sort of think all of us can pick up that mantle and say, I'm going to talk civilly to people who disagree with me. I'm going to like do that in Charlie's name and like honor Charlie's legacy that way. We can all kind of pick up that mantle.
It's interesting. Is there something that in your research, your writing, that you feel like doesn't get enough coverage?
Yes, definitely. And that is the fact that we write a lot about extremism, right? On extremism on the left, extremism on the right. But how do I say this? We don't humanize those folks. Ironically, we commit the same sins that we accuse them of doing. And it's so funny because I started out studying like the dissident right, for instance, and I was told going into this by people who are respectful, like, I sort of got the impression of like, these guys are like the worst of the worst. These guys are deplorables, they're groypers, they're edgelords, they're, they're like proto-fascists or like whatever name you want to put on them. They're racist, they're anti-Semitic, they're just the absolute like deplorables. They're like the edge of what Hillary Clinton was talking about in her basket deplorables comment. And then I started talking to these folks. And there is some of that. There is genuinely some like terrible racism on there. There is genuinely some horrible anti-Semitism. But I also ended up talking to folks. I just had a conversation with a guy yesterday, and he said, I'm just interested in the deeper questions facing society. And he said, I pray over every article I write, and I just want to make sure that like God's using me as a vessel to do good in the world. And it's like, man, you would not get that vibe if you just read articles about him, rather than if you talk to him. And I think that's how it is for a lot of us, I've seen that with my friends who are critical race theorists. It's like if I just read, as much as I love Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, if I just read their book but never talk to critical race theorists, I might conclude, oh, they're all bad human beings. But I have friends who are critical race theorists. It's like, no, you care so deeply about these kids you're educating. I disagree strongly with your ideas, but I can't fault your character. And so I see these folks on the far left and the far right, and I think we have to do a better job of humanizing them and of seeing their virtue and of seeing who they are. It's like, do they maybe have terrible ideas? Highly possible, you know? But terrible ideas do not make a terrible human being. And that's sort of my primary message.
That's a really interesting message. And I think this kind of gets back to intent versus impact. When you're looking at someone and you believe that they're a good faith actor, they're not acting in bad faith, they have good motives, they want what's best for people, they have a good heart. And also, you believe that their ideas are like extremely, I mean, just terrible for society, that are going to cause a lot of harm. How do you wrestle with that tension?
It's a good question. And I do wrestle with that quite a bit, and I probably get it wrong, honestly. I mean, there are probably articles I write where someone in one of those ideologies will look at them and be like, "Wow, Julian's an asshole," you know.
Hmm.
And so that I just say I'm always trying to do better, you know. But it's a very hard balance because I really do believe in being like hard on ideas and soft on people. And so I
Mm.
wrote this long piece about in after Charlie's death, 6,500 word article about the dangers of social justice fundamentalism, which is like the extreme end of the left. And I basically said, like, this is a pipeline to extremism. This is something we should be very concerned about. And I sent it to one of my friends who's a critical race theory teacher. And I said, hey, I really value your opinion. I want to make sure I'm being fair to your perspective. Will you please read this over and give me notes? And she gave me some wonderful notes. One of which was, you see the same problem on the right. And she's exactly correct about that. And so I try really hard in my articles, and sometimes it might come across as throat clearing, but it's actually very sincere. These are not bad people. These are good people who have bad ideas. And
Mm.
that is the most fundamental distinction, because from a Christian standpoint, we sort of all have bad ideas. Like, we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God, and we should all take a good hard look in the mirror before we take one glance out the window. But for all that, you know, God still made us in his own image. You know, we you know, when God looks at us, he loves us. And that's not because he's deluded or blind, it's because he made us this way.
Mm.
We can do terrible things, and I certainly sin every day, but doing and being are different. And I think we have to get back to that distinction in our society of I may disagree strongly with what you say, I may disagree with what you do, but I do not for a moment denigrate your worth as a human being.
I love that. I love that a lot. Um, there seems to be, and this is like my bias coming out, but there seems to be this idea of like, we could only have good ideas, like the least aggressive, least violent, like a classical liberal type of idea. We could hold those ideas, but because the other side is so bad, holding only these type of neutral or less aggressive ideas is going to leave us exposed and vulnerable. So we need to pick up some kind of toolkit of more aggressive ideologies as kind of a self-defense mechanism. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And I hear that a lot. And it's funny because I hear that from the right and from the left. Both people are saying, hey, my political opponents are so bad, and that's why I have to seize political power and punish them before they can punish me. And it's like, we're all driving this, you know, we're all driving this vicious cycle. I really like how Michael Ware put it, you know, Obama's theological advisor, and again in his book, The Spirit of Our Politics. He said, he was speaking mostly to Christians, and so he said, and so we can explain this metaphor to your non-Christian audience if things necessary. But he said, we may live in Babylon, but we should never for a second let ourselves become Babylonians. And I
Mm,
think that's really important.
that's a good quote. That was Haidt?
No, that was Michael Ware.
Oh, okay. Gotcha,
Yeah,
gotcha.
yeah,
That's interesting. That's very interesting. So, Julian, I've got one question left for you, and you may have already touched on this, but flesh it out as much as you like. And that is, when you look at society broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
yeah. It's a good question. Let's see. How do we humanize each other? I think that's the big thing. How do we see these folks on the extremist left or the dissident right, or even just mainstream Republicans and Democrats who we may not want to talk to because we're in our bubbles? how do we look past our ideological differences, or even look past some of the very boneheaded things that they might say, and how do we humanize the person behind those beliefs? How do you humanize the person in that camp? Because I think if we can get back to doing that, then we've got a pretty good chance.
Yeah, I mean that's a very Christian belief as well. I get back to that a lot of times. I'm thinking like Jesus washed the feet of Judas right before Judas betrayed him.
Mhm.
I mean, he's crossing ethnic lines to people who are considered the enemy. As he's dying on the cross, he's looking down at the people who are torturing him to death, praying for forgiveness for them. And when I hold that in my head, it's easier to have a little forgiveness for someone who calls me a mean name in the comment section on TikTok. You
Yes,
know?
absolutely. Yeah, well said.
Yeah, man. What is a way that you think people can kind of embody that what you're talking about?
Um, it's a good question, and that's the primary question, right? Is like this stuff all sounds very noble, but
Yeah.
we can't just lecture people of like Matthew 5:44, love your enemies, pray for those persecute you, and be like, here's the bar, find a way to clear it.
Yeah.
There's got to be a way to do it, and I think for me, what's really helped is this idea of what one of my friends named Jamie Winship calls the false self. And it's the embodiment of our fear and our guilt and our shame. And he's worked with terrorists all over the world to help them find Jesus and put down their guns. He's worked with people in civil wars. He's worked with Hamas and ICE agents and everyone to like help like demilitarize them basically, and help them become like, I'm gonna be a doctor instead of a terrorist. Doesn't that sound great?
Yeah.
And he talks about how like this false self is kind of the root of all evil in our world. Or the root of the pain that we cause other people is like we're in a lot of pain, so it boils over onto the other people. And so I think the main thing that I've found is when I turn to God and when I deeply cultivate a relationship with the divine, and I want to be clear because a lot of non-Christians don't understand this. I don't just mean like, oh, I have this book I read, or I have this hope that I'll get into heaven one day. I mean like Jesus as the ever-present friend and teacher, to quote Richard Foster. This sort of like perpetual communion we can have with the divine being as I sort of like give my shame and my guilt and my fear to God, what he gives back to me is better than those things. And so I've seen over and over again in my relationship with God sort of chip away at that sense of like false self. And so I've seen this in small things, for instance, like with my wife, it's like we were pretty tight financially for about a year. And I had a lot of shame around money because it's like, as man, he should be a provider, right? And so when we talk about finances, I could get like pretty prickly. And as I kind of kept working on it with God, I sort of kept letting go of the sense of shame and finding instead the sense of like, no, like you're my like beloved son, there is no sense of shame inside of you. And then that poured out into now we can have financial conversations. And even when they're tough, it's like, oh, this is just a problem to solve. This isn't like I'm some terrible human being. This isn't like poking at this deep wound inside me because the wound's mostly healed. And then I can be a much better and more empathetic and sort of less contentious husband. And I've seen that over and over again in my life. When I let go of my own fear and ask God to replace it with, courage, then I can be much kinder to people who I might be scared of across the political spectrum. When I let go of my own sense of shame and ask God to replace it with like his love for me, I can be much less arrogant and much less hubristic and much less like I am so much better than you. You need to listen to me, which is this sort of terrible trend in our society. And so I sort of think finding God is sort of the the master key that helps us do all of this stuff because we absolutely cannot live out the high bar of Jesus alone. That's his entire point in the Sermon on the Mount. We have to rely on the strength of God to do that.
Hmm. I love that answer. God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. Like God's the key to good mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, Julian, where can people find you?
Mostly on healthewest.org. Just like it sounds. If you Google me, I'm also the only one that wrote my name, so that's kind of how you do it. And then yeah, I write for Reality's Last Stand as well, and I'm on Twitter as Julian_Liberty, I think. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, on Twitter is Julian_Liberty. So that and healthewest.org are the main place to find me.
Awesome. Well, I love this conversation. There's a lot of fascinating topics we've touched on, and love to talk to you again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ryan. This was wonderful.